Hello there, Mad Mike here, and welcome back to the channel. And we are going back to an old video series called Will It Fail? And this series, today we're going to cover Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings. And that movie is actually coming out today, which means we have semi-accurate prediction numbers for it. So I'm going to go over those. We're going to go over the stars, the director, some of the writing and stuff like that. And we're going to try and see if we can determine whether or not this film is going to make money. Now, the base part of this is that, we know what studio this is coming out of. It's coming out of Disney. It's coming out of Marvel, which means it's going to have a relatively high production budget, and it's probably going to have a relatively professional look to it, even though there are some things in Marvel films these days that look like complete ass. It will probably at least look somewhat pretty to see on screen, except for when they put CGI over the Kung Fu fights. That kind of weirds me out a little bit. But regardless of that, the budget is, even though we don't have exact numbers, we can probably estimate it somewhere between 150 and 200 million. Black Widow was about $200 million, and if you look back at some other stuff they've done, like Captain Marvel was about 175 million. So we can probably say it's somewhere in that range. For the sake of argument, I'm going to go with 200 as a number because that's the high end. So if it manages to make money on the high end of things, it definitely made money on the low end of things. So we have our budget of $200 million. Now, we also need to look at kind of what this movie is doing right now and what has happened leading up to it, because this is one of those movies that was postponed by the COVID-19 pandemic, and it was supposed to come out, I believe, a year ago. And it got pushed back all the way to now. And this will be the second Disney release this year. They're also going to be releasing Spider-Man: No Way Home come Christmas time. And I think they're still trying to release Eternals, but I think that got moved to February of 2022. But regardless, this is a Disney film, so we all know what's going to happen. It's going to have all the nice little bells and whistles and stuff like that. And then when you go down to actually the director and the cast and stuff like that, the director is Destin Daniel Cretton, who doesn't have an extremely large filmography. He doesn't have a lot of experience in terms of his director's chair. He definitely has not had a lot of experience with movies that are about $200 million. And this feels a lot like the Ryan Fleck and Anna Boden of Captain Marvel, hiring people that are relative newcomers in order to come and do something. And they also hired him on as a director-writer, which is another thing they always like to do, which, again, can be a good or bad thing depending on how well they are at doing both. So you have that, which is it's up in the air, because I really haven't seen any of his previous films, so I don't know really how to judge what I'm going to see on screen from what I've seen previously. And that kind of leaves him up as an unknown, at least as far as I'm aware. So I'm just going to kind of put a pause on that, because I can't really tell if he's going to be an addition or a detriment to the movie, depending on what happens. Although Marvel does actually film their action scenes before they film anything else in the movies. That was a fun little bit of information that came out a few months ago. But regardless, going down the list, we can look past the director, and now we can look at the stars. So you have Simu Liu, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, and Awkwafina. And why the fuck would you have your stage name be the same name as a water brand? I'm aware it's not the same spelling, but still, it sounds the same phonetically. But she is a Chinese actress, and Simu Liu is a Chinese descendant. He's descendant from China, but he was born in Canada, so he's technically Canadian. But they definitely put Awkwafina in there for the China crowd, which is another thing that's going to be a detriment to this film, because this film is not getting a China release. And the ironic part of it is not getting a China release because the Chinese censors found out that Shang-Chi's father in the comic books, not in the movie, was named Fu Manchu. And Fu Manchu is a little it's a little derogatory when you're saying stuff like that these days. But regardless of that, because it wasn't in the movie, just because it's in the lore, the Chinese censor said, nope, we can't have this movie here. So it is not getting a China release, despite very, very hard going for that. Now, the other things you have in this movie coming back, you have Benedict Wong, and you also have Ben Kingsley returning, which is an odd one. I mean, I know he played the Mandarin in Iron Man 3, or the pseudo-Mandarin or whatever, but I'd be curious what they're actually going to do with him in this show. And that's also or not show, this movie. And that's the other thing too, is that this movie is a little weird to me, that you're bringing in a major Iron Man villain after you already killed Tony Stark. So I don't really understand what the point of that was. I mean, I understand that you needed a villain for Shang-Chi, but I feel like there would have been other options in this. But regardless, this is going to be based somewhat around the Mandarin, and the Mandarin, I would assume, would be the main villain. So I mean, it is a little bit of a draw, even though it's a weird combination. But like I said, Simu Liu doesn't really have a huge acting history. Most of it has to do with television. He was on shows like Warehouse 13, and I think he got a lot of good things from The Expanse. But he doesn't have a whole shit ton of roles that he has under his belt right now. So he's relatively young. He looks like he got in shape for this. You know, he looks the part. Let's put it that way. Even though the costume is a little like the rolled up sleeves and stuff like that. Like that just looks kind of weird. I'm not really a big fan of at least his costume design in that. Awkwafina again is another one they're bringing in. Again, that was probably mainly because of the Chinese audience, which I think she got sued by the Chinese government for not paying her taxes. Which you can't really do in a communist society because they'll just kill you. But the point is that you know, she was mainly in there for a draw, but she can act. I mean, she's been in other films. She's been in action. She's done action-y type of things before. She was Blink in X-Men: Days of Future Past. So she's a little bit familiar with the Marvel brand, even though maybe not this specific property. And like I said, the fact they're bringing in Ben Kingsley, I mean, anytime you add Ben Kingsley to a production, it's usually never a bad thing, even if it's a horrible film. Look at Blood Rain. But regardless of that, I can't. I add a little bit for the cast because the cast seems relatively good, and Marvel has some of the best fight people and choreographers in the business, which is why they film those scenes separately, apparently. But you could be sure at least the action scenes in the movie are probably going to be relatively decent in terms of that. Although I will say it is rather odd to see a kung fu fight assisted by CGI, and very obviously assisted by CGI, by the way, because when you kind of look at like past kung fu movies, like Bruce Lee films and stuff like that, like those guys were actually, you know, punching and kicking and doing all that stuff. It was choreography, so they weren't trying to hurt each other, but they're actually doing those movements, and it was really cool because it was edited really awesome, and the moves that they could do were amazing. You know, you have people with that level of talent in Hollywood, maybe not quite to Bruce Lee's level, but you had people that were talented, and they can do those action scenes. You know, Mortal Kombat showed us that. You know, even I know a lot of people have problems with that movie, but at least the combat itself in the movie was relatively good. And most of that stuff, at least the hand-to-hand stuff, other than the stuff where people are, you know, ripping people's arms off and shit, that stuff looked real, and they made it look real. So I think to assist it with CGI is kind of to take away almost from the kung fu to film art form, but that's maybe just my hang up and not other people's, but I'm not going to necessarily take that away, but it does take away from it personally for me. Now the other thing is that this film is getting a theatrical release. It is getting a 45-day exclusive trip to theaters before it goes to Disney Plus and other streaming platforms. So we're going to get 45 days of this in theaters solely, so the piracy market is not going to be able to get their hands on it as easily as they were Black Widow because of that same-day digital release, because people can just rip that shit. So I think it's going to have a relatively healthy opening weekend. However, I think it will still peter off relatively, and maybe not as quickly as Black Widow, because I think it will make more money than Black Widow. I would say that. And I think that's mainly just because of the solo theatrical outing, because we know for a fact that because of some things that Disney has put out in the public, that Black Widow made about $120 million from Disney Plus purchases. So taking that into account, you know, if even half of those people decided they wanted to go to a cinema, that's a significant boost to the box office of that film, especially for opening weekend, which $60 million of that $120 million consisted of, because Disney wanted to go and brag about that as soon as it happened. So yeah, I think the opening weekend is probably going to be relatively strong. It may be close to Black Widow, but I don't think it's going to go over. I think that it's probably going to be somewhere in close to the $70 million range. It's a Marvel film. It's going to have people drawn out to it. If it doesn't, if it underperforms, that's going to be even more terrible for Disney. So it's one of those things. This movie could go one of two ways. Either it does okay, it does numbers where it breaks even. Because again, even if we're going on the top side of this budget, even with the delays, we're probably looking at 450 million for it to break even, which I think this movie might be able to make. It may just barely reach there. So if we're looking at the lower end of the production budget, then I think it will. If this was like more of a $150 million film than a $200 million film, I think it'll probably make a little bit of money. But if it is that $200 million film plus all of that advertising budget, this thing is probably going to have to look at about, I think it'll barely break even. We'll see it'll crack 400, but it will not reach 500. And that is my prediction for the film in total. I think opening weekend you're probably going to see somewhere in the realm of between 60 and 70 million, but you're not going to see the 90 million they're predicting. But I think that the drop off is going to be less steep going into week 2 than what happened with Black Widow because of the lack of the piracy market. So that's why I think it's going to make a bit more money. But that's just my opinion on the film. I want to know what yours is. Are you guys excited for Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings? Are you not excited for it? Do you want to see it? Do you plan to see it? Are you going to pirate it? Put your thoughts in the comments below. As usual, I like to read them. Hit the bell for notifications, hit the like button, subscribe, and remember, I live my life free of compromise. Do you?